Ladies and gentlemen,
They say the next big thing is here.
the Steve Warnicki Show.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Steve Warnicki Show. Everybody's wondering, did Irma blow me away? No. That was stressful, though. 400-mile storm barreling towards you. We fled. We packed the pets in the car and just ran. And it was very scary. It's my first... I did evacuate last year, but Matthew was just like a glancing blow. This one was just bearing down. But anyway, I apologize for the lack of content at stevewarnicki.com. We were fleeing and then cutting and chainsawing trees, and I had no internet for a while, so the internet's back. You don't even realize how much you become to rely on this stuff. All right, so we are back. I am Steve Warnicki, retired Denver police sergeant and author of award-winning From Boy to Blue, available at Amazon. And after watching the news this week and after 72 hours of riots in St. Louis, I decided the podcast needed to be about the recent acquittal of the former St. Louis police officer, Officer Stockley. I also wrote an article about this case. It's at stevewarnicki.com. And in this case, and I've been saying this the whole time, the latest article's entitled, Have You Had Enough Yet? And in the article, we've put a link to the 30-page decision released by the courts in this case. Now, if you're not involved with law enforcement intimately every day, or you're not involved in this war on police, you're hearing all of this stuff out of your periphery. And here you go. Oh, there's another cop acquitted. More riots in St. Louis this time. And I raised this point in the article. I'm not even sure a lot of these protesters anymore care what the cause is. I'm sure there's some legitimate protesters that know about this case. I think a lot of this is just anarchists and other people trying to create chaos and wreak havoc and destroy property and intimidate government, because we're seeing more and more of this. And it's not even, a lot of it has to do with police cases, but we saw some of it at like the DNC. It's just becoming commonplace. And I talk about this in my article. It's a shame, because I think a lot of this could be nipped in the bud if government officials weren't so afraid of appearing to be shutting down freedom of speech of people. But that's really not what's happening here. I think they're afraid to act, and this goes on for longer than it should. And then we end up with situations where we have police officers injured and thousands of dollars worth of property damage when we didn't have to do that. I wonder how many of the protesters have read the 30-page decision issued by the court in the Stockley case. Now we have, as of last count, 11 police officers injured, 80 people in jail, businesses and property damaged. The great thing about America is there's always a legitimate way to address your concerns. You can get signatures, petitions, write lawyer or write Congress people. You can obtain lawyers and sue. You can go to court. You can protest as long as you do so appropriately and obtain permits or don't block streets and don't destroy things. There's always a way to let your voice be heard in this great country. And one of those ways has never been and should not be hurting police officers and vandalizing property. If you've been following what we've been doing, and an increasing number of people have been, I have been saying this over and over with different cases that we're talking about and different topics that we're addressing, that you have to address each case, each controversial police case, or just even any case we look at involving the police is unique. There's too many factors to apply broad brushes to all of this. And I've been talking at great lengths about how transparent government is, and this is a great example of transparency is this case. It's not like there was some secret witch trial or some secret trial, and then all of a sudden some racist judge without any provocation or reasoning went, I'll just let him go. This is sound logic and transparency at its best. You can read this. It's available for public consumption. I only saw one of the major news networks that put it out when I looked. It was Fox. I don't know if anybody else did, but it wasn't readily available. You had to rely on the media's recap of this. Well, don't do that. go read it. It's only 30 pages. This isn't even a book. This is just a little bit. 30 pages. This is an episode of television right here. And it's intriguing. You like cop shows? You want to know about this? Read this for yourself. Don't rely on me. Don't rely on the media. Now, I implore you to read the case, even if you just sort of care about this stuff. Even if you're just mildly interested, just go read one of them. And this is a great one to go read. So I do want to break this case down a little bit because I want to show you and illustrate the kind of detail that goes into this and the kind of transparency that already exists in government with regards to these cases. You can find a link to this at stevewarnicki.com. We'll put a link on Facebook and YouTube and where we're trying to put the podcast so that you can pull up the PDF. But if you're having trouble, go to stevewarnicki.com, go to my articles page, and click on Have You Had Enough Yet? There's a link to this. Read it yourself. It would be great. All right, so let me give you a bit of a factual recap. I honestly, I really just wanted to sit down, just turn the cameras on. I'm going to read all 30 pages. That's what I wanted to do, so that you could get a feel in its entirety for what this document contains, and you don't leave there with a feeling that the facts got cherry-picked by somebody with an agenda. Now, I'm obviously pro-police, but I recognize that police do make mistakes, and when they do, I'm willing to go with that. They should be held accountable. But when it's not there, it's not there. So let's do a little factual recap. I am cherry-picking these because I can't read you all of this. We don't have the time for it, but do it on your own. But those of you who aren't so familiar with the Stockley case, let me give you a brief recap. December 20th, 2011, officers saw Anthony Smith and his companion, Kirkwin Taylor, in the parking lot of a Church's Chicken acting suspiciously. The officers went to contact him and pulled in behind Smith's Buick. Smith is the main character here who ends up getting shot by Stockley, who's the main police officer involved in this. Smith frantically gets in his car, backs up, crashes into a fully marked police car twice, and hits a third car in the parking lot, speeds off, and leads police on a high-speed pursuit with speeds up to 87 miles an hour through the community, not just endangering the lives of the officers, but the entire community. This wasn't somebody who was jaywalking. This is somebody who chose to smash a police car and flee from the cops, endangering the community. There's lots more details if you want to read the case. After the chase comes to an end, Officers Stockley and Bianchi ran up to the car to try to arrest Smith and were shouting commands. Stockley contends he had seen a gun on Smith when Smith drove out of the parking lot, and there's testimony that Bianchi also yelled gun while they were in the parking lot back at the Church's Chicken. Officer Stockley contends that Smith reached for something and his demeanor changed. The officer believed Smith to have located the gun and was about to bring it up to shoot the officer, so Officer Stockley shot his weapon 5 times, fatally wounding Smith. Okay. Let me tell you some other facts. A full-size revolver was found in the vehicle. So was a bag of heroin with the DNA of Smith on it. Here are some bumper sticker lines being shouted amongst the anti-police crowd and protesters. Stockley, the officer, planted the gun. Stockley's DNA was found on the gun, found in Smith's car. Smith's DNA was not on the gun. Officer Stockley said during the chase, "We're killing this motherfucker, don't you know?" inside the police car. Officer Stockley had a rifle which was unauthorized by the police department. Stockley reached in and fired a 5th kill shot after firing 4 shots at Smith. You hear those bumper sticker slogans, and if you're not on the front lines of this, that's what you've been hearing, and you go, well, that sounds like bullshit. It's crazy. Cops are getting acquitted. It's crazy. You don't need to be Perry Mason to know this officer did anything wrong. Read the case. Let me talk to you about the rationale for the decision making by this judge was very sound, in my opinion. I not only think the state of Missouri failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Stockley was guilty of first-degree murder, but in my mind, I'm convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer's actions were 100% reasonable. This is so far from being in the gray area, as far as I'm concerned, that it's amazing this case saw the inside of a courtroom. It was a waste of taxpayer money. As we address these points, I want to start by saying that the people that are rioting from this incident that occurred between a police officer who was a graduate of West Point, a military veteran who served in Iraq and was present at the 2004 bombing of the Sheehan Motel, and a dispute between an urban armed heroin dealer, as the court decision letter referred to Smith. And none of that is race related. Do you know that? None of that is race related. Do you know why? Because there's West Point graduates who are military veterans, who are police officers, who are African American. And there are heroin dealers who are white. All of that has nothing to do with race. It has to do about the people that we're talking about individually. Now, here's some of the evidence in this 30-page, just some of it, that refutes the bumper sticker points that I told you. With regard to planting the gun, Officer Stockley was not wearing a jacket over his police uniform. There was no gun visible in his hands, in his pockets, or tucked into his belt. The police belt's 3 inches. This was a full-size revolver. Couldn't have been concealed in a hand. Wasn't a small Derringer or anything like that. Would have been sticking out of the belt. Would have been a bulge in a pocket and sticking out of a pocket. There was video obtained from dash cams. There was video obtained from a cell phone that was a witness for the state, and none of that showed the officer had the gun. Then you think back to the points I already made. Bianchi yelled, "Gun in the parking lot." Stockley testified he saw a gun in the parking lot. See, by itself, you go, well, that's the officer's word versus the... Start to look at all this together. That's just one piece. So is the bulge and the other cameras and the sticking out. Start to look at this all together. Not as one fact, because you could always say, oh yeah, the officers made that up. Okay, maybe, but I doubt it. And here's another piece of sound logic and good reasoning. The court, in its decision, made mention that in nearly 30 years of the court's experience on the bench, an urban heroin dealer without a gun would be an anomaly. How about we look at that? Keep that in mind. It's just another piece, right? Keep in mind, heroin was found in the car with Smith's DNA on it. There were other officers at the scene, one at the time, shortly afterwards. None of them testified. None of them saw. You're talking about a group of police officers. Surely somebody would come forward. Unless you're of the belief that just every police officer sucks and they're all just making up shit. So nobody came forward. It was a huge conspiracy based on all these officers. You can argue, well, Stockley's DNA was on the gun. At one point, Officer Stockley removed his winter gloves to go get Quick Clot, which stops bleeding out of the back seat of his car. He also, you can't manipulate things with winter gloves on. That just makes sense. You don't have big mittens on trying to reach for stuff in a bag. Also, police officers are taught to make the gun safe. You have to make the scene safe. You shoot somebody, you don't just back up and go, yeah. You typically handcuff the suspect. You don't know if they're dead. You don't know where the gun is. You're trying to render everything safe. You don't want a witness to come in the car, get the loaded gun. So Officer Stockley reaches in and with his bare hands manipulates the weapon, unloads it, leaves it on the passenger seat, and makes the scene safe. That's what you're trained to do. That's what you're supposed to do. That explains 100% why Officer Stockley's DNA was on the gun. The absence of DNA on the gun by Smith. They had forensic experts. Nobody could say that this fact meant that Smith had never touched this gun. It just wasn't conclusive. That's just one piece, but when you start to look at all of these things together, they add up. It's not just one piece versus another. It's one piece after the next, after the next, after the next, all pointing to the same conclusion. How about the "we're killing this motherfucker" line? Listen, for me personally, I think there's lots of people who have stuff go through their minds. I mean, I've thought this about the person ahead of me at McDonald's who's taking forever to order. Like, I'm just gonna kill this motherfucker. Just order. Like, I've thought that stuff. I never do it. People think that. Now, my mother probably doesn't. There's plenty of people that don't think like that. But there's lots of us that are like, I'm gonna kill this fucking guy if he doesn't put his signal on, right? Okay, again, you could argue. It's just one piece. We could argue about that all day. We could get into debates and whether or not, but let's look at what happened subsequently. Because for me personally, that statement is not a smoking gun whatsoever. In my mind, people routinely think those kinds of statements. Also, you're in the heat of a stressful police pursuit. I've personally been in police pursuits. It was very stressful. The court made mention of listening to radio dispatch tapes that both officers were clearly stressed. You say things in the heat of passion while your adrenaline's up. He could have meant, we're going to kill this motherfucker, don't you know? Like, he's not going to give up until we have to are forced to kill him. That's what he could have meant. You don't know. That's not a smoking gun. All right. Now, interpretation aside, let's even set our interpretation aside. You go, well, I think that is a smoking gun. Let's look at it after. Does an officer who's going to murder this suspect, and that's his intention, pull out his unauthorized rifle and just start shooting him? This Officer Stockley went up to the car and for 15 seconds was trying to give commands and make an arrest on Smith. That doesn't follow that you're just trying to murder him immediately. They're trying to apprehend him. Stockley testifies that Smith reached for the gun and his demeanor changed. Now, this is the kind of subtlety that gets lost that you can't find from a cell phone camera or a dash cam that's 20 feet away. So much of communication is nonverbal. If you're holding someone's arm as a police officer and they tense up, you can't always see that on camera, but I can feel that and I can articulate that. You don't have to have been a police officer to have experienced this. Have you ever been in a fight? You're talking shit with somebody at a bar and they get that look right before they punch you? Their demeanor changes. Their eyes narrow. They look at you. You know they were about to do something. That's important when an officer says that. If that's what he perceived, that's important. So even if you want to discount that, then you can look at the forensic evidence. And there were doctors and FBI specialists and all kinds of people that looked and evaluated the physical evidence in this case. And the testimony from experts was that Smith wasn't just seated in his car. The wounds were consistent with Smith reaching to where the gun was found. How do you know? Because you get shot in the lower left abdomen from the driver's side window. That's because you're reaching. You can't get shot there if you're just sitting facing forward. Those are the kinds of details that are in a report like this. This report is so detailed, it talks about the puffs of smoke. There were allegations that a kill shot was fired. There was a puff of smoke. And they look at the video evidence. They show none of the other shots had a puff of smoke. But when you did see smoke through this whole thing was the breath of the officers. This is the kind of detail that's in this report. They look at all this, and it's available for anyone who wants to read it, to understand what the decisions were made. To show you the rationale of this judge. It's not just some guy on a throne going, he's not guilty. It's sound reasoning. And it's not just one tidbit of he said, he said. It's one piece after another after another. It's a totality, a cumulative effect. There was all this talk of the officer carrying an unauthorized rifle. Listen, there are officers that carry guns that aren't authorized. That is not against the law. The rifle was not used to shoot Smith. It wasn't deployed. He just had it. He admitted it was against policy. That is a departmental issue that they're going to sanction him for later. It's certainly a disciplinary issue, but it has nothing to do with first-degree murder charges. The rifle program at the police department where I worked was slow to get off the ground after Columbine, which was one of the first mass shootings. And there was talk that officers carried rifles back then because they would rather get in trouble for carrying the rifle versus have to face a Columbine shooting with their handgun. This report goes into the laws, the burdens of proof, And everybody's entitled to the same due process. Every element of the crime has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Why would an officer not be subject to that? That's what would be required if we were to convict you of anything, or you can't be found guilty. But we weren't even close in this case. We weren't even close. If you argue that the burden of proof should be different for a police officer than the average person, then I would imagine you have an anti-police agenda, because I can't see that being the case. Why would law enforcement officers not be able to be convicted at a lesser burden of proof? Because there's still civil trials that don't require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They require preponderance of the evidence, which if you were to put that into numbers is 51%. So that's a civil burden of proof. But that goes for everybody. The standards are the same. They're equal. And it goes on, and laws, and what a peace officer is allowed to do, and what's required of a peace officer using force. And that if police officers are not required to retreat, everything is in here. It's comprehensive. And I don't think a reasonable person can read this and go, that's bullshit. It's not sound. You can't read this report and look at everything as a whole and go, yeah, let's go break some windows, light some shit on fire. It just can't be done. So even if you're not on the front lines of the war on cops, please just read this one. Go to stevewarnicke.com and read it. Even if this is the case you only sort of care about, I want you to see what I've been talking about with regard to transparency, with regard to totality of the circumstances, with regard to reasonableness. I want you to see what I'm talking about. This is already in place. And I'm begging city officials to please, let's not be worried as people are rioting, blocking traffic, smashing police car windows, hurting police officers. Let's not be worried to put a stop to that. The Denver Police Department, where I worked, was recognized for their crowd control tactics as some of the best in the nation that were deployed during the DNC, the Democratic National Convention that I was a part of. It was amazing. We reformulated crowd control for police officers, and I won't get into all the tactics of it, but it worked very well, and it's now catching on around the nation. So we have, as police officers, have the resources to address this early so that we don't get to a point where 11 police officers are hurt and all these businesses are vandalized and police cars and all of this. There's legitimate avenues. If you have a complaint, if you want to see change, if you want to affect change, all of that is there. But I have a feeling most of these folks, that's not really what they're concerned about. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for being with us. Thanks for your time. Thanks for everything. We'll see you over at stevewarnicke.com. Hope you'll get your copy of From Boy to Blue. We'll see you soon. Take care. Let's stop the rioting.
Marching.